subcommittee for 1-minute opening statements each, and then we will hear from our panelists. And without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 legislative days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation of the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. 3 years ago this month, the self-immolation of a Tunisian street vendor would set in motion a series of events that would fundamentally change the political landscape of the entire Middle East and North Africa region, a period we now call the Arab Spring. Finally fed up with autocratic rule, with corruption, with a lack of basic freedoms, thousands of Tunisians took to the streets calling for democratic and social reforms and an end to the malign 23-year rule of their leader. But though there has been some significant progress made since his ouster, there's still so much that needs to be done to meet the goals and the aspirations of the Tunisian people who began this process, as I said, 3 years ago. By most accounts, the Tunisians had a successful National Constituent Assembly election in October 2011, which brought a party into power together with the Tunisian 2 leading secularist parties. However, the newly formed government quickly ran into obstacles that it could not overcome, and Tunisia's transition came to a grinding halt this summer when a prominent secular party member was assassinated. The assassination eventually led to the formation of a national dialogue process to jumpstart the reconciliation process, to select a caretaker government and get Tunisia back on track for a new round of elections. But the national dialogue has been met with its own set of obstacles, and the negotiations over who will be the caretaker prime minister has caused an impasse. Now, as the political process has paused and the future of the Constitution and elections are in question, Tunisia finds itself at a crossroads as frustrations begins to set in and the rift between the secular and Islamist ideologues continues to grow as both sides battle for legitimacy. Compounding these political problems are the economic and security challenges facing Tunisia, as all 3 are undeniably linked and all 3 face an uphill battle. However, one of the most pressing issues from a U.S. perspective is the threat of Islamic extremism in Tunisia. Foreign fighters and homegrown extremists have challenged the stability of Tunisia, and while the Tunisian security forces have thus far been able to combat Al-Qaeda, AQIM, and its affiliates, these terrorist networks continue to pose a threat to Tunisia and to the region. Tunisia's border with Algeria is known to be a training area for the terrorist groups, and the insecure border with Libya is a major area for concern, as it is vulnerable to smugglers and others who wish to cross into Tunisia undetected. Terrorist attacks like the one on the U.S. Embassy in September 2012, as well as the assassination of 2 prominent secular politicians, threatened to derail the political process. With Tunisia being the birthplace of the Arab Spring, we must continue to support the democratic aspirations in their hopes that it can come through this transition successfully. For better or worse, the fate of Tunisia is tied to the reform movements throughout the rest of the region, as it is viewed as the test case for the democratic transitions in the Arab world. It is in the vital national security interest of the United States to see a secure, a stable, and a democratic Tunisia, and I hope the administration does not overlook the importance of this strategic country. We must remain engaged throughout the national dialogue process and beyond to ensure a successful transition to democracy in Tunisia, and we must not allow the terrorist groups to derail the political transition nor gain any more influence in an already susceptible region. And we must work to find effective ways to assist Tunisia as it struggles to fight this rising threat of terrorism. This is a critical juncture for Tunisia, for the region, and for the United States' strategic interests. We must support the people of Tunisia as they struggle to achieve real reforms, and we must also support groups like the IRI, the NDI, IFIS, who are on the ground day after day promoting democracy in this vitally important region and working to find a consensus among all parties on a new constitution and a new electoral process. With that, I yield to my ranking member, my friend Ted Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses for testifying today on the state of Tunisia's transition. Thanks as well for your patience as we prepare to head off to vote. It's been 3 years since a Tunisian street vendor changed the course of Tunisia in the Middle East. As we all remember, Mohamed Bouazizi, an unlicensed vendor, was being harassed by police and accused by local authorities of evading an arbitrary fine. The police confiscated 6 crates of his fruits and his electronic scale and denied him any appeal. In debt, tired of being harassed, without recourse and without economic opportunities, Bouazizi set himself on fire. His act became a catalyst for the Jasmine Revolution and the wider Arab Spring, and it incited demonstrations and riots throughout Tunisia and the region in protest of social, political, and economic issues. In the months that followed, the world held great hopes about what Tunisia might become. In early 2011, Tunisians ended the authoritarian regime of then-President Ben Ali, and in October 2011, Tunisia held elections that were praised as free and fair. Political and civil liberties were expanded, and it appeared that Tunisia would become a model for the rest of the Middle East. Unfortunately, Tunisia has fallen short of the lofty and perhaps unrealistic expectations that were set in 2011. Political squabbling has limited the structural reforms needed to guarantee democratic institutions, and this summer's assassination of a prominent secular leader has left many Tunisians not only disillusioned with their country's growing political polarization, but also increasingly worried about their own safety. Under former President Ben Ali, the Tunisian people were used to the stability of a police state. However, violent extremist groups have exploited the region's porous borders. With terrorist attacks on the U.S. Embassy and a popular tourist resort, Tunisians are increasingly frightened and seeking stability. Furthermore, many of the same economic challenges that contributed to the Jasmine Revolution still exist today. Youth unemployment among college graduates is over 30%. Tunisia's international credit rating is poor, and the increasingly unstable security situation has been particularly damaging for a country that employs 400,000 people in the tourism industry. Furthermore, according to press reports, not a single project from the 2012 budget has been fully implemented yet. In short, it's not clear that the everyday life of Tunisians has improved since the ouster of Ben Ali. A young Tunisian protester was recently quoted as saying, "We live in desperate conditions because of unemployment, poverty, and misery. We are only asking to live in dignity." My worry is that continued political stalemate and instability that are plaguing Tunisia may make the country increasingly vulnerable to political actors who could set the country on a path back toward an authoritarian state. We all know that establishing a democracy is not easy, that political squabbling is by no means limited to Tunisia. This political conflict, while damaging, is not being fought with bullets. The Tunisian political parties have seen the devastating conflict in Syria. They've seen the errors of Morsi in Egypt. The parties have all publicly agreed that widespread violence and exclusionary governance that has plagued the region is not what they want for Tunisia's future. The ruling Ennahda party has shown that it can compromise on key issues and rein in hardliners, demanding conservative amendments to the Constitution. Rein in those hardliners demanding conservative amendments. The party eventually agreed to step down to make way for a caretaker administration, which is why the Constituent Assembly, which is drafting the Constitution, will remain in place and will hopefully produce a Constitution that establishes the structures and institutions that are necessary for a democratic Tunisia. The United States has made a pledge to the people of Tunisia in support of their transition to a democracy, and although success has not been immediate, in many ways Tunisia still has the best chance of turning into a consolidated democracy. And that's why, despite the challenges, the success of Tunisia is key to our interests and our ideals. I want to thank NDI, IRI, and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems for your contributions in Tunisia. Not only are you doing key work in strengthening political parties, civil society, and providing election support, but in many ways, it's your organizations that are representing the American ideals of equal opportunity and dignity for all, and we are grateful for that. Although the attention that Congress and the American people are paying to Tunisia is probably insufficient, I hope that today will provide an opportunity to remember how great the consequences are of Tunisia's quest for democracy. As we saw in 2011, The future of Tunisia will be decided by the Tunisian people. But if democracy fails, there are no good alternatives. Therefore, I believe that the United States has a vital role to play in helping to assist a democratic, free, and stable Tunisia, and I look to our witnesses to provide your perspectives on what's happening inside the country, your reactions to U.S. response so far, and your recommendations for Congress and the United States government. I thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Thank you for your excellent statement. I now would like to grant the 1-minute opening statements to Mr. Schneider, followed up by Ms. Meng, and then Mr. Vargas. Mr. Schneider is recognized.
In the interest of time, as votes have been called, I'll yield my time back.
Thank you. But we've got plenty of time. Don't worry. Ms. Meng.
I yield my time, too.
Thank you. Mr. Vargas.
I also yield my time back, but I do thank the people that we have here today and look forward to their testimony.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then we'll come back and hear from you. First, we welcome Mr. Scott Mastick, the Regional Director for Middle East and North Africa at the International Republican Institute. In this capacity, he has helped grow this division into the Institute's largest regional division. Mr. Mastick has led various democracy assistance efforts in the region and served as an election observer in many countries, including Tunisia, Egypt, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Next, we welcome Mr. Leslie Campbell, Senior Associate and Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the National Democratic Institute, where he has directed programs in this region since '96. Mr. Campbell has 25 years of experience in international development and parliamentary governance. Thank you, sir. And third, we welcome Mr. William Sweeney, who is the President of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Prior to this position, Mr. Sweeney served on the Board of Directors and as Chairman of IFES. Mr. Sweeney has observed elections in the Philippines, Russia, Nicaragua, and Jamaica. We thank all of you for being here, and when we come back, if there are any members who would like to make an opening statement, I will recognize them first, and then we will hear from you, gentlemen. And with that, the subcommittee is temporarily on vacation.
So Joe handed it off to me. Lauren handed it off to Joe Garcia.
I really liked him. I mean, what I appreciate about him is just like, listen, like there's some things you need to really question the administration on. Like there's some legit points that are just like not detailed in this. And I was like, it's kind of refreshing to listen.
The subcommittee has reconvened. Thank you so much. Mr. Mastic, we will begin with you for your remarks. And as I said, all of your written statements will be made a part of the record. Thank you.
Chairman Ross-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important topic of Tunisia, a country that I remain guardedly optimistic about despite a number of challenges that continue to confront its transition.
Could put the microphone a little bit closer.
How's that? There. I offer this sense of optimism based on what we have seen during the past 3 years, and especially as a result of the interactions among Tunisia's many political stakeholders. Unlike Egypt, where the troublingly authoritarian behavior of the country's Muslim Brotherhood irrevocably polarized relations between the political forces, or like Libya, where we see an absence of security making its successful transition incredibly fragile, or like the horrific effects we see from Syria's civil war, what we see today in Tunisia is a continued effort from political stakeholders to reach agreement through negotiation. This is not to say we could take for granted Tunisia will be successful, and to the contrary, the country has reached its most pivotal make-or-break point yet and currently stands at an impasse. Today, I'd like to briefly elaborate on what I see as 3 key factors to the transition either moving forward successfully or going in a different, less optimal direction. First is the political track of national dialogue agreed to by the current government and opposition parties and moderated by the so-called quartet of civil society entities. Key actions related to the ultimate passage of a constitution, an electoral law, and appointment of an electoral commission extend from the dialogue's success, but ultimately, these important benchmarks will not be achieved unless the political parties agree on a caretaker prime minister and government that could shepherd the country to elections. Recent public comments from UGTT Tunisian trade union leaders, which are mediating the dialogue, suggest the primary political parties remain committed to the process and that it may resume even this week or next. In the current state of negotiation, the key factor appears to be neither side believing it can leverage too much advantage or dig in for a better deal. The willingness of the main parties to reach agreement at the negotiating table is of paramount importance. Second is security, and specifically the threat posed by Islamic extremists. We have seen the poisoning effect that acts of terrorism have had on Tunisia during the past 3 years. This has contributed to polarization between Islamists and secularists, with the latter believing the al-Nahda-led government has been too slow to recognize the threats posed by jihadists. Future acts of terror, and especially at this critical moment, could derail the national dialogue before a successful interim government is put into place. This would leave Tunisia in a free fall. Therefore, time is of the essence in avoiding a potential terrorist-induced crisis. Third, and perhaps most important, is the continued patience Tunisian citizens are willing to show towards their political leaders. My sense is that the patience of ordinary Tunisians directly relates to the state of the country's economy and the belief that the transition offers at least the promise of economic betterment in the future. How long Tunisians will accept the current conditions is unclear, but Tunisia's politicians should not assume limitless goodwill, and the indicators at present are not that good. A public opinion poll conducted by the International Republican Institute in October found that 79% of Tunisians say the country is going in the wrong direction, the highest yet recorded number. The economy, and specifically jobs, continues to count as the most important problem as Tunisians see it. Disturbingly, in the October survey, an increasing number of respondents, 29%, say they are having a hard time feeding themselves and their family, while 48% say they are making just enough to get by. Future Tunisian governments must prioritize economic issues. Addressing these issues, though, is not possible with the current political impasse. As with the other factors, it seems the longer this impasse continues between the major political forces, the more frustrated Tunisian citizens may become based on their desire for better life opportunity. With respect to our programming and democracy assistance, IRI was registered by the Tunisian government in November 2011 and has been able to pursue active programming with all political stakeholders throughout the country. My continued optimism about Tunisia is linked to what we are experiencing through those interactions. Programs from the international community are widely welcome, which is always encouraging, but from our vantage point, what distinguishes Tunisia is the seriousness shown by the political parties and civil society in developing their organizations. Tunisia's civil society is playing an important role in advancing human rights, women's rights, and transitional justice, and we see key civil society groups in a central mediation role attempting to advance the transition. I cannot stress how important this point of wanting a democratic system to emerge is. The Arab world continues to lack a successful working model of elective democracy, and when one looks across the region, we are hard-pressed to see something with more promise emerging sooner elsewhere. Even as the current dynamic is uncertain, I believe Tunisia remains the best hope for a democratic political transition in this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Campbell.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to testify in the state of Tunisia's political transition. Since the toppling of Zine Abidine Ben Ali, Tunisia has made significant progress toward establishing democratic institutions. While Tunisia's transition is today more vulnerable than at any point thus far, there is reason to hope that the country's experience can and will continue to serve as an inspiration to those beyond Tunisia's border. Serving as part of the leadership of NDI's International Observation Mission in October 2011, I witnessed firsthand the hopes that many Tunisians placed in the National Constituent Assembly elections that they would represent a solid step toward a more democratic future. Ennahda's moderate Islamist leadership sought to form a broad coalition to share the responsibility of governing. The ruling Troika coalition, formed by Ennahda and two center-left parties, took power in December 2011. In these 2 years, the coalition has struggled, but remained intact despite the often strained communication among its members and increasing pressure from opposition political parties. If there is an early lesson in the post-Arab Spring aftermath, it is that coalitions and consensus building are far preferable to winner-take-all politics. Egypt went the route of winner-take-all and paid the price. Tunisia has chosen thus far to be more inclusive. Unfortunately, the Troika government has struggled to address the growing economic and security challenges as the Tunisian economy has generally declined or stagnated. Last week, the Tunisian currency hit an all-time low. New figures show the unemployment rate hovering just around 16%, with university graduate unemployment closer to 34%. Thus, the young Tunisians who are widely credited with bringing about the revolution are those being left behind. Some Tunisians have accused Ennahda of failing to crack down on violent extremism, a perception that was fueled by the assassination of two leftist politicians. But the assassinations, and as the assassinations caused a political standoff between Ennahda and the leftist and secular opposition, there were efforts to broker a settlement which led to the signing of a national dialogue process to address four fundamental issues. First, the composition of a new apolitical technocratic government. Two, reaching agreement on the final sticking points in the Constitution. Three, appointing the leadership of an independent election administration. And four, agreeing on the sequence and timeline for presidential and parliamentary elections. Tunisian views about the dialogue are clear. To begin the process of restoring public confidence, all responsible political parties must return to the negotiation table immediately. They must work to complete the constitutional phase, making it possible to hold elections. There has finally been movement on the constitutional process and the naming of an interim prime minister. Yesterday, opposition members of the Assembly returned to hash out remaining disagreements. There are also rumors that there is finally a compromise candidate for prime minister. Despite Tunisia's numerous challenges, reasons for optimism remain. The transition has moved forward in fits and starts, but it does remain on track. The Tunisian value of consensus over expediency remains a strength. There is a growing perception, though, in Tunisia that the world has lost interest in this important democratic experiment. The international community should enhance its support of the Tunisian transition, emphasizing that an immediate return to national dialogue negotiations is essential to demonstrate commitment to democratic principles and fundamental freedoms. The mediation team, in my opinion, should announce a definitive date for the dialogue to recommence and stress that any party that fails to participate will forfeit its right to contribute to decisions. Tunisian politicians must conclude their agreement to nominate a caretaker prime minister, and that may happen soon. They must finalize the Constitution, appoint the election body, and outline the next steps in the transitions. These steps are absolutely required to address pressing citizen priorities, including salvaging the economy and ensuring safe and secure communities. While there is an urgent need for more international economic support and assistance, and I hope that this is addressed more in this hearing, the United States should also strongly and consistently support popular demands for transparency, accountability, and freedom. This means a continued commitment to pluralism and civil society and speaking out very clearly with respect to the ongoing threats to freedom of expression. Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Campbell. Mr. Sweeney. If you could push that button there on the mic and hold it close to your mouth. Thank you.
Okay.
I thank you for the opportunity to testify in this hearing on Tunisia's transition and democratic development. The International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, has received grants from the U.S. government and other international donors to conduct an on-the-ground assessment of the electoral environment and provide technical expertise to the Court of Accounts, civil society, various ministries, and the country's first independent election management body, the Independent High Commission for Elections, known as the EC. On October 23, 2011, Tunisians held their first democratic elections and elected a National Constituent Assembly called the NCA. The elections were administered by the EC. They were seen as inclusive and competitive. Public confidence was high in the electoral process. The EC received high praise for its independence, commitment, honesty, and successful delivery of elections in a short time frame and under difficult circumstances. Since those elections, frustration and disappointment have dominated. Progress in adopting a new constitution for Tunisia and the institutional and legal framework for elections has been slow. Parliamentarians elected in 2011 have received most of the criticism. Opposition parties are now contesting the legitimacy of any legislation and calling for dissolution of the NCA. Two political assassinations of prominent leaders have adversely affected the potential for any political consensus. As a result, Tunisia has yet to adopt a new constitution and develop a new legal framework for the upcoming elections. The EC's 2011 mandate ended in May of 2012. This means no electoral preparations, no election law, no election commission, no budget, no plan. There remain enormous challenges and risks, and the country is losing valuable time in the current political stalemate. While minor difficulties with the 2011 elections were largely accepted in stride by the population, the same tolerance may not be forthcoming for the next elections. Simply put, if the administration of the next election does not meet public expectations, a lack of trust in the results is possible. Internal stability and the nation's transition will be threatened. For the 2011 elections, IFES provided technical expertise and guidance to the EC, trained election management staff, established the EC Media Center to announce results and election-related communications before, during, and after Election Day, assisted the EC in design and distribution of 10,000 posters and 2 million flyers for voter education efforts throughout the country, partnered with the Ministry of Social Affairs to communicate with illiterate voters on the election and how to vote, and train members of iWatch, a youth-led civil society organization, to be the first independent organization to monitor campaign finance expenditures during the election. After the 2011 elections, IFES focused on EC's performance and lessons learned. With funding from USAID, IFES carried out a technical evaluation of the NCA elections and in-depth analyses of the legal framework for elections and campaign finance regulations. Thanks to support from the U.S. government, IFES has remained in country and continues to play a role in helping Tunisians in their democratic transition. IFES meets regularly with legislators to advise them on electoral legal reforms, trains judges in charge of monitoring campaign finance expenditures, and works closely with local civil society organizations to help them all be advocates for inclusive democracy, in expectation of the next round of elections in Tunisia under a new EC. With support from the European Union and the United Nations Development Program, IFES sustains the dialogue and debate among Tunisian political stakeholders on voter registration, electoral system design, election management bodies, and campaign finance, a process which has been underway all year. Madam Chairman, the Arab Spring started in Tunisia. Tunisia is the furthest along in its transition, has the most engaged, robust national conversation on democracy, and has the greatest institutional capacity to succeed. Tunisia's success will be a model for other transitioning countries in the region and in the world. Despite setbacks, Tunisians are highly engaged in the political dialogue, not violence. I was in Tunisia this past February. IFES conducted the largest attended forum in the region on voter registration and the value of a trusted voter registrar. The next few months are critical as Tunisia appoints a new government, selects new election commissioners, finalizes its constitution, and develops a new elected law. Madam Chair, thank you for putting a spotlight on Tunisia today. This is a critical time in the history of the country. It is critical that there be a focus on the opportunity for democracy in this region as well as the threats. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, all three of you, for excellent testimony. And I will begin the round of, of questions, and I have many of them, so if you could jot them down and address whichever one you'd like. As we had discussed, the national dialogue process has stalled, but the dialogue between opposing parties continues. No party has walked away completely from the process, and they remain engaged in an attempt to reconcile their differences. One major achievement would be if the parties would come together and agree on a caretaker prime minister and cabinet. This could stabilize the country, guided through its next round of elections. How far apart are the parties on deciding on a prime minister, and what are the main obstacles that have prevented them from coming to an agreement? Mr. Mastic, I had the opportunity to review IRI's latest polling data from Tunisia, and from October it states that 79% of Tunisians believe that things are headed in the wrong direction. Only 16 believe in the right direction. And when asked how much longer the National Constituent Assembly should take to complete its mandate, nearly two-thirds of the respondents said less than 6 months, and over three-fourths said less than a year. And although we can agree that placing artificial timelines on such a delicate process is not the best practice, but given the overarching trend of dissatisfaction, how much longer do you think that this political stalemate can last before political transition in Tunisia is permanently derailed? Time is clearly an issue for the Tunisian transition, and in this case we have economic, security, and political clocks all working against each other, all moving at different speeds. Do you gentlemen believe that the leadership can adequately address all three tracks at the same time, or does it need more time to need more help from outside sources? And if so, what does Tunisia need the most in order to ensure a successful transition? What programs do your institutions have in place to promote new elections, to build local capacity? And finally, women's rights. Tunisia has been touted as a leader when it comes to women's rights in the Middle East and North Africa. Ever since Tunisia gained its independence, as we discussed in '56, women have had an even more prominent role in society compared to the counterparts in neighboring countries. And this was illustrated by the elections in 2011 of the National Constituent Assembly. 27% of the seats won by women. But there are many reports of gender inequality, violence against women. What would you say is the current status of women's rights in the country? Are women's concerns being evenly represented in the national dialogue and in the drafting of the Constitution? And we will begin with Mr. Mastic.
Thank you. With respect to the process and how far apart the parties are, I think at this point really it's come down to who the prime minister will be. And the polarization that has grown in Tunisia over the last year between the major parties, and specifically Ennahda, the Islamist party, and Nida Tunis, has made the selection of that individual very difficult, because one does not want to be in a position of having given an advantage to the other. Based on the various iterations of governments Tunisia has been through since the 2011 revolution, there are definitely personalities, I think, that both can agree to. Neither have walked away. The public statements of the mediating body right now suggest they are very close to identifying that individual. So I don't think they're far apart, and I think that you could see progress on this very soon.
So much. Mr. Campbell.
Well, I would agree that the rumors, speaking to NDI's office director in Tunisia today, there are very strong rumors on the street that a name has been put forward. I won't mention the name now because who knows if it will happen, but a name is put forward. It's not been rejected. So there's clearly talking. I should also mention, just as we were speaking, Sheikh Marou, who is the vice president of the Ennahda Party, walked into this meeting room, and I think it's significant in the sense that I've met with him. He's been in Washington, I think, on a mission to say, look, we're reasonable. We want this to work. We want this to be a model. And there's a recognition, I think, among most Tunisians that they do not want this to fail, that they want Tunisia to be seen as a democratic model. It would be the only one other than Israel, and it's very important to Tunisia. So there's goodwill. I think the message, though, of Tunisians certainly that come to Washington, the message that I'd like to leave today is that without economic help, and you address these different tracks, without people's lives improving, all the election commissions and political parties and so on in the world won't succeed. And of course, as organizations, we work heavily on the political process, which is important. Governance is vitally important. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say that politics will fail. And again, talking to leaders in Tunisia, they've said very clearly the cupboard's bare. They don't have the money in the budget to cover their expenses. They don't have the prospects. The currency's at a low. The credit rating has dropped. Their borrowing costs have gone up. So I think that if there's a track that is not being adequately addressed, it's the economic track. The political track, I think, will take care of itself. The question of women, my answer would be that on the surface, Tunisia continues to lead. 27% of the members of the Constituent Assembly are women. At the top level, at the elite level, you'll find many women in leadership, positions. But I think if you scratch below the surface, and especially if you get away from the capital in the interior, you see a very different reality, a much more typical, traditional Arab world type of situation. And I think redoubling the efforts on human rights, on women's rights, is absolutely important. I think we shouldn't be too, fooled by sort of the flash that you see in the Capitol. And the one thing I'd add at the end is that some of the statistics that were put forward under the rule of Ben Ali were blatantly false. There was a sense maybe that women had made greater achievements than they actually had in reality. They sort of inflated the statistics of, for example, of literacy. Literacy among women is much higher than Ben Ali's government had ever led on. So investing in that area, I think, is vitally important.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sweeney.
Madam Chairman, the problem of being the third speaker on this panel to those questions is I'm in violent agreement with everything my two colleagues have said.
Nobody has said it quite as eloquently as you're about to say it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give it my best shot. And what I would say are two things. Number one is that if you look very closely at what happened in 2011, this decision makers seemed very far apart, and because of the very robust engagement, when they came to agreement very quickly. And so they were able to conduct their election in October of 2011. They were able to make decisions very quickly because much of the spade work, much of the discussions had already taken place, and there was a consensus, and you didn't have to revisit every decision. So I do have great hope that when they come to consensus, they can come to consensus very quickly. Number two, the point I would make on women is in complete accord with my colleague. However, you should know that you have a colleague who is the chair of the election management process in the Parliament, and she is one of the most engaged legislators I've met over the course of the last year. She is very conservative, she is very traditional, but she also is very aware. I had a long dinner with her one night about the importance of more than 50% of the population having a political voice and more than 50% of the population in Tunisia having their rights fully exercised.
Thank you very much. Excellent answers. Thank you. So pleased to yield to my friend, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. For the last couple of years, the administration has proposed to implement a Middle East and North Africa incentive fund. And in addition to allotting money for contingencies, the fund is going to be built on a model of incentives for good governance that would result in additional foreign assistance similar to the Millennium Challenge Corporation model. Presumably, that would be a big benefit to Tunisia. I support the idea, I like the idea of allocating significant and flexible resources to the region, but like others, I have some questions about the details of the fund. I'm curious to know from the three of you what your opinions, since you're really implementers here, what your opinions are of this fund. Is it something that you would support? How would it be used? And ultimately, how could it be beneficial to Tunisia? We'll start with Mr. Sweeney so he doesn't have to go last this time.
Congressman, I am not particularly familiar with the details of the implementation of the fund. However, what I know is that if there is a reward for good governance that results in the type of institution building that the Tunisians are famous for, that the Tunisians ought to be able to meet the metrics and expectations. And certainly it is a society which desperately needs continued investment and engagement, and has shown over time that they can perform economic miracles within their own country. So I would be positive of both the metrics and very confident of the ability of the Tunisians to meet those metrics and use whatever foreign assistance from the United States or the European Union or any other donor to maximum advantage to solve what Les referred to as the more serious crisis, the crisis of unemployment and investment in the society.
Thank you. Well, I would strongly support the idea of an incentive fund, but just to go backwards for a second, I should say, first of all, that the administration, congressional resources, congressional interest in Tunisia up until recently has been very, very strong. I think it's still strong from the funding side, certainly for what we do. None of us went into great detail of what we do, but the support has been strong for the process, for training political parties, working with the Election Commission, working with women, human rights organization, domestic civil society organizations. That's been quite strong. What's missing, and I think this is germane to the incentive fund question, is something in addition to that. So I think the idea that if the country, and I think there's tremendous willingness in the country, if the country is going to behave democratically, seek consensus as they have, govern itself well, as you said, Millennium Challenge style, a way of incentivizing that performance would be great. I know in our conversations, we're often dealing with very high-level political leaders in Tunisia. Their comment back would be, we really appreciate what you do. Over the long term, this is fantastic. But if we can't provide evidence that people's lives are improving, this is all going to go backwards. And so I think the incentive fund is necessary. I think U.S. diplomats often feel a little hamstrung right now. They have a lot of talk. They don't have a lot of, scratch, basically, to use a colloquial term.
Right. And Mr. Masker, before you answer, Mr. Sweeney talked about donors, Mr. Campbell talked about scratch. Who are the other? We often have these discussions without acknowledging that there are other countries that would like to be involved, that would like to exert influence in a country in transition like Tunisia. Is that the case? Am I right? Is that the case here? And who are they? And what role are they playing and trying to play?
Definitely others are involved. So, of course, the IMF has given an important loan stabilization program to Tunisia. So that's a key actor right now. The European Union, though, also is very much involved, invested in Tunisia. According to the EU's neighborhood policy, they see Tunisia as a very important country in transition in the region. I will say, though, that I think from the Tunisians that we interact with, there is a perceived interest and value in a ongoing and robust U.S. engagement in their country. And as I think it holds the best promise among the transitions occurring, I think we benefit a lot from that engagement. Quickly, just with respect to the incentive fund, I don't know that many details about the fund. I think one of the challenges with the idea of the fund is that the details about what in fact it would do have been a little bit murky. So that's something to obviously take into consideration. But the idea of incentivizing good governance in Tunisia, of course, is something to be supported. I also would say that with whatever types of programming that will be supported through the fund, we have to have it be reflective of a transition process and support for democratic development as well. And I'll just put that in a very specific set of data. In the initial revolution, we did a poll immediately after, and 79% of the people at that time said the country was going in the right direction. Okay, that number was never going to stay that high. And it slowly went down in the months that followed. At 2 points, though, did the downward trend, reverse itself. One was shortly before the NCA election, when people were essentially 50-50 on whether the country was going in the right direction. And then immediately after that election, the number shot back up in a positive response rate, and the only time it shot back up in a positive response rate. So the political process is very much tied to the other challenges Tunisia faces, and needs to be part of any type of fund or incentivization of good governance and behavior in the country.
Mr. Deutsch, if I could add one or two specific points. Swiss foreign assistance and British foreign assistance have been part of our program in Tunisia. We have worked very closely with a variety of elements within the European Union Neighborhood Program and some of their democracy assistance. We've also had a terrific partnership with the United Nations Development Fund on all of the aspects of voter registration, election management. That was one of the meetings that I referred to in my testimony. But the U.S. government should be commended at this point, because the U.S. government has had staying power in terms of the programs that it has been supporting in Tunisia, whereas some of these others have been very limited projects. But there are other organizations, other governments, other interests involved.
So much, Mr. Deutsch. Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Cotton of Arkansas.
Thank you, and thank you all for appearing today on this matter. So I believe that one reason that America has been so great and so prosperous for so long is that we're not merely a democracy, but a constitutional democracy. Too many other countries around the world, sometimes with too much support from the West, reduce good government to elections, which are certainly very important, and they're the principal way to hold the government accountable. But they underplay the significance of constitutional forms, both the structures of government that we have in place here, like the separation of powers, unitary executive, an independent judiciary and prosecutor, as well as individual rights, rights of freedom of speech and religion and assembly and immunity from arbitrary and indefinite arrest, and so forth. Mr. Sweeney, I'll let you start off, and then Mr. Campbell and Mr. Mastic, I'll let you maybe respond. You had said in your testimony that Tunisia still does not have a constitution. The Assembly needs to adopt one. I'd just like to get your perspective on the prospects for a constitution that has both those kind of structural and those individual rights guarantees.
I am very positive that the Tunisians are going to adopt a constitution. They have a long history of institutions and regard for those institutions. When I was in Tunisia, I met with representatives of the courts that were engaged in reviewing campaign finance reform issues. I met with different ministries. I met with a great number of parliamentarians. In just about every meeting, there was great regard for individual rights and the need for the Constitution to reflect Constitution and then the behavior of the institutions to reflect an open democratic society. So generally, sir, I'm very, very positive that they are moving in the right direction, and more importantly, from a perspective of our history, many of these institutions are in place and have a robust history and have very committed public servants who are leading them right now. So the debate is fully engaged. We are not dealing with an artificial process. We're dealing with a country which has a great, robust, strong history and great institutions.
Would you care to venture any guess on a prospective timeline?
I would concur with my colleague, Mr. Campbell, that it's possible we're going to see the first step, which will be the caretaker government put in place. There has been more than enough debate and dialogue within the society, and reflecting back on 2011, they move very, very quickly once they come to consensus.
Thank you. Mr. Campbell?
Sure. Maybe I can, since you made a philosophical point, maybe I'll respond with a bit of a philosophical point, which this idea of a concentration on elections, I think there's some truth to that, and many organizations, people have been guilty of that, And there are a few lessons, I think, of the Arab Spring thus far, and one is that rushing into competitive, contested elections is a mistake. Why is that? Because, as you say, in part, you don't have the structures, you don't have the bedrock to work from. But secondly, you have this big tumult in the country, an uprising, and then the first thing that happens, in the case of Egypt, within, say, a month or 2 months, is that we throw political contestants who have very little experience into what appears to be a winner-take-all process, and you raise the stakes so high that the tension goes through the roof, and I think that's been a big mistake. One thing that Tunisia has done well, among others, but it's done very well, is it has kind of let this process play out over time, and I know that we sometimes become impatient with that, delays and so on, but I actually think the delays are okay. As long as the delays are not there to, to the benefit of one group, one partisan group or another. One thing that's impressive.
Can I take back my time for a moment just to ask you to elaborate on that point? That is a happy side effect of the delays, is that you have time for mediating institutions like political parties or a free press to come about. I was a soldier in Iraq. I saw that happen there as well over the years as they were preparing for round after round of election. Have you seen those kind of mediating institutions maturing in Tunisia in a way they didn't have a chance to in Egypt?
Much more so. So you have a very strong opposition, and one of the interesting side effects of the time is that the opposition, which was very weak during the election, is now very strong, which has actually caused the standoff. Ennahda is unable to impose its will. That is worrying for the economy because you've got this stalemate. But in the long run, it may be okay. And Tunisians are serious about their constitution. It may be because of the French influence. They see a document like that as very important. I'll just throw a little comment about Egypt. Egypt has, for the second time, drafted a constitution in 2 months, and they're going to have a referendum 25 days later. That's not how it's done. I think Tunisia, as much as it's unsettling, probably is doing it in a much better manner, but it would be terrible if the economy in the meantime falters and fails.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Cotton. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, and I want to thank the witnesses for your insights. As you've highlighted, this is an important issue for not just the region, but for the United States. Mr. Mastic, you closed your submitted comments with a line, and I'll quote, Tunisia remains the best hope for a democratic political transition in the Arab world. And you touched on this sense within Tunisia of declining confidence of direction, but plateauing. And this may not be a fair question, but does the hope remain for the Tunisian people, and what are their aspirations? What would the outcome that they want to see that would change that curve in an upward direction?
Sure. Certainly some of the economic aspirations that I think people have, expectations that they have, are not achievable, not in short order. There's no question about that. However, with movement on the political track, we consistently see renewed confidence in the democratic process. And even as satisfaction with where the country is headed right now is at an all-time low, you still see a slight majority supporting a turbulent democratic system than some other model. And so, I do think that it's very much rooted in sort of general sense of hope, and that could quickly turn when you see progress on the political track.
Yeah, I think the idea of hope springs eternal, but without hope, all things are lost, is important. The future, and I'm going to turn to Mr. Sweeney, the future depends so much on those institutions, and you've mentioned a couple times the strength of Tunisian institutions. What are some of the ones that you have the most confidence in? What are some of the institutions that we should be watching a little more closely and working to reinforce?
Most confidence is sort of high to measure right now because the country is really at a stalemate in terms of making progress on a whole series of political decisions. So it's relatively difficult to give you an answer and say A is better than B. And in our particular area of expertise, IFAS, we're going to be starting all over again. Now, the good news, and one of the reasons why I say they will move relatively quickly, is the Parliament already has a list of 36 candidates. 9 of them will be appointed to constitute the next election commission. That's part of the dialogue that's going on. However, at the same time, all the investment that was made in 2011 in terms of the election commission has basically gone away. The staff that we trained has moved on to other jobs because the election commission's mandate, budget, everything expired in May of 2012. So we're going to be starting over again. And I think that's part of the frustration that's expressed at the political level that's also showing up at the economic level. That great progress was made, aspirations, dreams, hopes got to 79%, and then all of a sudden the process got gridlocked. And that's where we are right now. I have great hope that once they get to consensus, they will again demonstrate the ability to move very, very quickly.
Mr. Campbell?
Well, a quick part of the answer is that we know which institutions Tunisians don't trust and that don't work, and that's basically the security institutions and the police. And it's partly not their fault in the sense that it's been difficult to restore order, but partly the trust is not there because there were decades of experience of the security services, interior security, being used for repression. On the other hand, the military is still by far the most trusted institution. Unlike in Egypt, it has shown no inclination to get into politics. It really is genuinely above the fray. And so those are the sort of polar opposites in terms of institutions. But Tunisians do have trust in government. The ministries have traditionally operated reasonably well. There is a history, actually, of technocratic ministers. It's interesting that the ministers immediately post-transition, many of them were drawn from previous governments. They were seen as able figures. So I think the ministries are well regarded, military is well regarded, but the security services are not, I think, is the basic answer to the question.
So I'll close with this. I'm almost out of time. But the need to reinforce those institutions to work with the military to try to establish a credible security infrastructure, what policy recommendations, and you can submit these later, what policy recommendations for us does that lead to, and what are the timelines that would be realistic? Because it is the time and space to build those institutions that I think are going to become critical going forward. And I'll close with Mr. Mastick's remark, ensure that Tunisia is not just a hope for a democracy, but an accomplishment of a democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Collins is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it's a normal Wednesday around here with markups and everything else going on, so I appreciate getting in here. But I wanted to be. I think the story in this arena is 3 years, and it's amazing what has happened in these 3 years, not just in this location, but across the world. It really came from it. My question is fairly brief, but you can answer how you want to. It really deals with economic issues. What is the likely course of Tunisia's economy, and what is the appropriate role of its international partners in helping Tunisia to promote economic growth and job creation and to address regional inequalities, which I think is one of the issues that came up? And then really what steps, if any, can or should the United States take to promote bilateral trade and investment? Sort of an open-ended question, but I think it started sort of as an economic in some way, and I think the future will be based on economic and how we go forward. So I'd just love to hear what you think.
Sure, I'll respond briefly to that. First, again, IMF assistance is important for macroeconomic stability in Tunisia. That is happening. I think efforts to promote regional integration, regional economic integration, are an important part of the solution to both the jobs and economic growth problems in Tunisia and elsewhere in the Maghreb. And then lastly, with respect to the United States, efforts encouraging U.S. Investment by U.S. companies and to lower the barriers for U.S. companies in Tunisia are important.
I want to just follow up there, and I want to get to you as well. But you made the interesting comment, the regional aspect there, especially with the instability that is inherent right there. What can be done to overcome that? What can be done to encourage it, even with Europe, what can we do there? Because you mentioned that, and it is an interesting concept.
Sure. I mean, the obvious factor here is with Libya, you have a potential economic giant that could really help with respect to growth in the region, jobs creation. But the security challenges are a serious obstacle to that. So it's sort of like you can't address something simply at the economic level. There has to be a redoubled effort on the security level as well.
No. Ms. Gamasini,
I was going to say, this is a great answer because I was privileged to go shortly after the transition to Tunisia with Raj Shah from USAID and looking at economics, not normally my field. And one of the things that sort of struck me is just imagine Tunisia's human resources and youth, educated youth, highly educated youth, 34% unemployment rate among college graduates. Marry that to Libya's wealth, enormous wealth, and Egypt's population and sort of consumer possibility. It's not going to happen soon, but you can imagine a North Africa Union, and they do have, there are some talks about this, the North African Union being a really strong economic force with Algeria and Libya's wealth, Tunisia's people, Egypt's population. In the immediate term, it's tourism and agriculture. Tourism, was a driver of the economy, main driver. In touring Tunisia with Raj Shah, we saw a lot of high-tech agriculture and science, but Tunisia is very, very fertile, can feed its own people, already or did export agricultural products. So I think short-term is tourism and agriculture. Long-term is opening the borders between these countries in North Africa.
Again, sir, I'm going to concur with my colleagues. I'll point out that tourism is a good 10% of all of the country's economies and sources of foreign exchange that you referenced. Tourism directly goes to whether or not the local population feels that they have a government that works and provides them with a modicum of security, as well as a message to tourists as to whether or not they can travel there in safety, which means that you have to double down on security and you have to double down on protection of infrastructure if you're going to try and develop a regional economic framework in terms of oil, natural gas, or any other major commodity.
Well, I think what's interesting there, and you just said something, my background is I've a lot of counseling involved in, and the very thing I tell with people who have a problem is the very thing that you need to fix it is the very thing that's broken. And then in a relationship, whether it be husband, wife, or anybody else, is trust. And if that trust is broken, it's the very thing that you need to rebuild the relationship, but it's broken, and it's like trying to run on a marathon on a broke leg. You're just going to have that issue. Great answer. I think one of the interesting, maybe for a time for another hearing, is if there was a joining together there, that is an interesting power shift that could occur from a lot of different areas, especially from Israel on over from that side. So that's another topic for another day, but I do appreciate you being here. Those are answers that I think we need to continue to panel. And Madam Chair, thank you as always.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vargas of California is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to briefly say, Mr. Sweeney, you're very correct about being the most engaged and charismatic chair we have, and certainly rival the election committee chair in Tunisia, I assure you. She does a fantastic job here. I wanted to continue to ask the questions on the issues of the economy. You mentioned Libya. Libya is about half the size and population as Tunisia, I believe, and it is smaller in GDP than Tunisia. So I was curious when you said that Libya is this powerhouse for Tunisia. Could you further comment on that? It caught me off guard there.
Yeah, I don't know the exact figures, but just as an example, Libya has a budget surplus, a big budget surplus, even without oil being refined and pumped at its previous levels. If Libya got its current capacity, when I say current capacity, I don't mean building new capacity, I just mean the capacity it has up to speed, it would have, and again, I unfortunately don't know the exact figures, but it has a budget surplus of many billions of US dollars. Whereas Tunisia has a big budget deficit. I believe it's something like $500 million. I just heard this the other day. So you're looking at something with billions in surplus versus $500 million in debt. And it's oil wealth. It's that simple. Small population oil wealth. But Libya had traditionally imported its labor, and they had bad relations with Tunisia. So you have the educated young people of Tunisia, highly technical. You have Libya that has always had labor shortages because of being a resource-based economy, and you have Libya with surplus cash. So there's a real potential combination there. And they're not enemies at all, but they don't have any, right now there's no structure of inter-country partnership.
Right. And just, again, the curiosity for me, because, again, Libya's GDP is smaller than Tunisia's GDP. So, it may be the case that, the government's doing better. But I guess the reason I'd say that is because it seems like the Jasmine Revolution began because of, issues of unemployment, the youth, and, obviously the self-immolation was a trigger, but all these problems, and the problems seem to still be there. And with growing well, I don't know if it's growing unemployment, but I saw that the growth rate did slow down this year compared to last year. So you do have the economy that's slowing down. I mean, these problems are problematic. You have this tumultuous democratic system you're trying to fix, but underneath that, it's the economy that makes the old economy stupid. So could you comment on that? Because I think that is the issue. Recently, we had the opportunity, a few of us, to go to the tribal areas in Pakistan, and we saw that the roads were being built, dams were being built, and people seemed to have some hope for the future because things were getting done. And here it seems like, if I was a person there, it seems like, yeah, we're going the wrong way, I thought this was supposed to be better.
Yeah.
Could you comment?
Want to go, Bill?
I'll take the opening opportunity. Tunisia, you have a real country. It's not a country that's been cobbled together in different ways over time. And now that a dictator is gone in the case of Libya, different identities are coming out. You do have a country with Tunisia. Mm-hmm. The other important thing to remember about Tunisia is that it is extraordinarily rich in agriculture. As Les said, it can feed itself. It has a population, it has an educated population, but that population has not been given opportunity in the last few years. So there's enormous opportunity there if there's investment, if there's confidence, if there's trust, if there's some stability. That's not true that's not as easily something to say about Libya. That's not as easy to say about some other countries that are in transition right now. And so you're hitting the central point. And the central strength and the reason for optimism about Tunisia and why it needs and deserves the attention is because it really is a country. It's not just a collection of peoples that were put together in a colonial map. And it does have a constitution, it does have strong institutions, it does have a very robust political process.
Yes,
well, I'd maybe just add that there's so many challenges in these countries, including Tunisia, but there's a real political debate about the type of economy Tunisia will have. You've got very strong leftist parties that would prefer to continue the system of subsidies and sort of a state-run or a managed economy. The ruling party, Ennahda, is actually a little bit more free market oriented, and then you have the small liberal parties that are sort of radically free market, and there's a very, very strong debate. I don't think there's any consensus on which direction they're going to go with their economy, so that's another issue to think about.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Connolly of Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And welcome to our panel. Mr. Campbell, would it be fair to describe Tunisia under the former President Ben Ali as a police state?
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
you would concur, Mr. Mastic?
Yes.
Mr. Sweeney, in light of that, and I assume you don't dispute that, how vulnerable politically is Tunisia to a backlash in terms of opening up? That an authoritarian figure comes along and says, yeah, but the price we're paying is lack of order, chaotic politics, and we need to restore that order. What kind of appeal would might such a figure have in Tunisia, in your view?
I think over the course of the hearing today, each of us has highlighted the fact that there are threats to Tunisia, and those threats are somewhat based on the economic situation, somewhat based on the security situation, somewhat based on the current political stalemate, while at the same time each of us, I believe, has pointed out there's great hope and optimism, and there is the opportunity for the entire system to work. But would you, if you were doing a risk analysis, would you completely discount the potential of an authoritarian figure coming back into play? No. No, you couldn't discount that. But I don't believe that any of us, or at least to my knowledge, have that as a potential outcome in the short term. We're all very optimistic that the current very robust political dialogue that is underway will result in the opportunity for a new constitution, a new election process and the voice of the people being heard and acted upon hopefully within the next year.
And obviously part of the answer to what you're saying is building enduring democratic institutions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Tunisia has a history of institutions which gives us great hope.
What are the implications in terms of the Tunisian evolution for the other Arab Spring countries?
I think all of us have great hope that Tunisia will become the working model of a democratic system and a working model for other countries, other judiciaries, other parliaments, other election commissions, other news media, other civil society groups to use as their model going forward.
Mr. Campbell, Mr. Mastic,
sure. If I can add just one point on the previous question, a great part about Tunisia is that during the last election, 27 parties won at least one seat. The ruling party, Ennahda, or the plurality party, I should say, won around 50%, but there are many, many other parties. So they didn't have the pendulum swing of Egypt, where you had this kind of, Mubarak to Muslim Brotherhood back to the sort of, former regime. So I'm optimistic that they won't go back to a dictatorship. I think the best hopes in the Arab world right now in terms of models are Tunisia and Yemen. And even though they're very different countries, what brings them together is the idea of consensus and coalition building. And so both have coalition governments, both have a dialogue process, formal dialogue process, and both are seeking consensus. I think we have to be careful not to rush them into further elections, make sure we're, let them play this sort of political negotiation out a little bit, don't rush, number one. But number two, both Yemen and Tunisia need this economic help. And we were, of course, discussing that a lot here. It's not sort of in the cards, it seems, in Yemen and Tunisia to get the economic help. But if we don't rush them, if we allow them to play out this kind of coalition building negotiation and we support them economically, we can have two models. But Tunisia will be the more modern, it'll be the one that we recognize in terms of its inclusivity, proximity to Europe, and so on. So it's probably more important.
Mr. Mastic.
Yeah, I would concur with that for the reasons Les points out with respect to Tunisia's institutions and the proximity and sort of cultural affinity that it would have with the West, more so than you'd find in Yemen. I do, at this point, I hesitate, or I would caution against the positive effects or spillover effects of a successful transition in Tunisia in other transition countries. Definitely, Tunisia was the critical country to start the Arab Spring. However, we are not where we were in 2011 anymore, and unfortunately, very different processes have played out in Egypt and Libya. Having said that, and as I said in my statement, Tunisia is important because the region, the Arab world, lacks a successful working model of democracy. And so for that reason, I think it's incredibly important that there be strong engagement, continued engagement in Tunisia.
Thank you both. And I do think it is, if this can work in Tunisia, it at least creates another model, especially for places like Egypt. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly, and thank you to our panelists, to our members, to the audience. I feel greatly encouraged after hearing from our three specialists. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you very much.